Cast your mind back to 2016. It's been 30 years since the release of Metroid on the NES, but the celebration of that anniversary is mournful. The series has laid dormant for the past 6 years since the release of Other M, as the game's terrible reception led Nintendo and its affiliated developers to be wary of approaching the series again. Samus Aran had since only been seen in spin-off games such as Nintendo Land, Smash Bros, and mere days following that anniversary, the infamous Federation Force. Not a game infamous for its quality, but the fact that a cooperative shooter with a multiplayer mode eerily close to the smash hit Rocket League was far from any semblance of Metroid, and was taken as a spit in the face to fans who wanted a true entry in the seemingly dormant series. However, those who played the game were rewarded with a promise, echoing one made in 2007 by Retro Studios. It was soon clear that Federation Force was just a premonition to Metroid Prime 4, the announcement of which a year later would revitalize hope in the fanbase. But considering that game would naturally take a long time to develop, even before the entire development was restarted in early 2019, it makes sense that Nintendo would simultaneously announce a remake of Return to Samus, having greenlit Spanish developer Mercury Steam to create Metroid: Samus Returns. However, Mercury Steam are notable for being the only developer to have worked on both namesakes of the Metroidvania genre, having developed the Lords of Shadow games and the Castlevania series. Considering too that this was the first major game in the series since Other M, and the first 2D game since Zero Mission in 2004, this game was seen as anything but a small footnote on the series. Samus had returned, with a game to set the standard of what was to come. And if this is the kind of game we'll be seeing a lot more of in the series, then I never want to play a Metroid game again. From the first time I saw this game, I had a bad feeling about it from this clip alone. An enemy charging at you as soon as it sees you in a narrow corridor, meaning the only thing you should even attempt to do is the counter. To my mind, Metroid's combat has always been about moving, dodging enemy attacks, maneuvering around platforms without getting pushed off, lining yourself up for that shot. Seeing the counter and 360 aiming, mechanics that required you to patiently stop dead in your tracks at each enemy, to patiently wait for them to kindly attack or more kindly die, and seeing the design of the game heavily pushing you into using them was the first red flag of what was to come. I was hopeful, however, so I tried not to use the counter for the entirety of my first playthrough, and it was painful. My only options were to tediously mash shots into enemies or waste missiles. Even early enemies can take 2 to 3 missiles each, and both options still rely on aiming. Or you could try avoid, no way you're avoiding these near-instant homing attacks in these narrow corridors, or getting past clusters of enemies without a scratch. Admittedly, I did find out on my 5th playthrough, that you can kill frozen enemies with the counter, which makes the combat a bit more mobile, but is also similarly frustrating, and I didn't realize for 4 whole playthroughs because the ice beam sucks and I stopped using it after Area 1. I'd even tried to wean myself off the counter when getting footage for this video, but it usually felt easier and safer to just sit and wait for enemies to bumble their way over to me so they could charge, than to bob and weave my way around them. Especially when I was low on health or Aeon and could use the drops, because, oh yeah, if all the flashy visuals, the narrow corridors you fight in, and the cutscenes to explain the feature weren't clear enough, using the counter is so obviously what the devs want you to do. But even though this is blatantly playing the game the wrong way, there are still enemies that won't attack you in a way you can counter. So this ends up being the intended experience for an annoying amount of your playtime. But even still, with the counter, it's not much better. Enemies are still placed, so you need to be constantly vigilant and tiptoe your way everywhere so you're not caught off guard by something barely on screen. In fact, the game loves putting shit right at the room transitions to fuck you over if you're impatient or let your guard down. And it often feels like you need to take care of every last bug in your way or risk losing what can be tanks of health on higher difficulties. Heck, sometimes the game will just plop these dumbass bats in midair or right at the lip of a platform so you don't even have the time or space to counter them. But even at their easiest to counter, every encounter ends up being a 5-second fight that consists entirely of waiting for their attack and pressing a button with good enough reactions. And that part is really weird to me, because despite the fact that the game makes several steps to make the series a bit more approachable to non-fans, the counter ends up being little more than a you must have this quicker reaction time to have fun, which just feels like the game trying to be inaccessible to people. In the end, both of these options are uniquely fucked in some way, but they aren't limited in a way that makes the combat fun. Everything just feels really awkward. Until late game, that is, when you're strong enough with the plasma beam, screw attack, and Aeon aplenty to breeze through most enemies in your way. Ironically, it actually feels more cathartic to walk through enemies with combat being such a chore up to that point. Or at least it should if the game didn't nerf the screw attack, that it does this dinky little bounce off enemies further into the game, and didn't just dump a shit ton of those bugs in your way that you can only kill with Aeon, which led to me running out a lot and having no option but to avoid them. And then there's the boss fights. Generally, they range in difficulty from Omegas, which drag on a bit, but I'm alright with that because they're adorable and I want to hug them, to the most annoying little shits I've ever dealt with depending on how the game feels. Like, seriously, they just turn their indestructible asses towards you and spend 5 seconds shaking off your ice beam as soon as it hits them, and then it just fucking leaves, so you have to crawl into the next room to try and kill it more. I do like how a lot of the later fights in particular push you to be more mobile and evade attacks though, especially forcing you into the air, as the space jump was something the other 2D Metroid games rarely if ever utilized in their bosses. But not only are several of the arenas slathered in goo for seemingly no reason but to limit my movement and annoy me, but maybe I'm just bad, but when I've been standing still to do quick time events on every enemy so far, should the game expect me to be great at moving around and dodging? I swear I'm not trying to make excuses by blaming the game for my own mistakes, But with all that considered, it's a pretty easy game overall. There's a lot of frustration, particularly in the controls, but little in the way of actual difficulty. But that's mostly due to the abundance of invisible checkpoints of bosses in certain events. It means the game rarely gets a lot of the tension of other games, because dying and trying again is a pretty quick process. If anything, I think it only made the game more frustrating, as they restore you to whatever health you were at when you hit the checkpoint, and I was personally more likely to say, alright, let's try that again, I can get it this time, when I respawned outside a boss room with low health, than to refill it, or maybe even go looking for items that would help me. So any boss I walked into with low health led to me just bashing my head against it until it went away. One of the most praised elements of the game, particularly by non-Metroid fans, was the Scan Pulse, an ability which reveals the immediate area of the map and highlights destructible blocks. Metroid has always had those Metroid moments, as Donkey called them, with items and paths forward being obscured by one block on a completely blank floor. There are aspects of the game's design that make their worlds feel unintuitive and unwelcoming, and while I'd argue that works in their favor, they do not belong in a game aimed at bringing in new fans. After all, they aren't a key feature of the series or the genre that you need to work around, they're just bad designed. You don't need to put the way forward behind some unintuitive bullshit. So the player wouldn't need something like the Pulse if they wouldn't need to bomb every wall without it. So, similarly to the counter, I looked up how to skip the Pulse when I was recording footage for this, so I wouldn't even be tempted to use it. And while I was fairly well equipped to get through the game with what little I remembered from previous playthroughs, and mostly eyes, there were still a good few times where the only way to get out of a room or to progress forward was to seemingly bomb any wall that seemed slightly suspicious, or even those that don't. This game regularly does the exact same shit as the 2D games before it, arguably worse. And while I would have preferred they remove these moments entirely, I will admit it can get away with worse than other games because it has this tape over its bad design. And fundamentally, I do see the importance of having the option to get direction or hints in-game, even in the post-internet world we live in, but the execution here could have been better. Case in point, Super Metroid had the X-ray scope, which was not only optional and out of the way, if only obtainable fairly far into the game, but it was fairly tedious to use, which meant that you only resorted to it when you actively decided to search for the way forward. Or, for a solution already in Samus Returns, just spend a power bomb, a much more precious resource than a bit of Aeon, to brute force your way through the puzzle. The Scan Pulse, in contrast, ends up harming the experience even for people who don't need it, because it's such a cheap, effective quality of life improvement for filling out your map that you just end up mindlessly pressing A every few screens, revealing all the secrets in the process. I feel like that's more of a problem with the fairly outdated map system than with the Scan Pulse itself, however. And yes, uncovering the map was hell for me without the Pulse, thank you for asking. But let's not forget that the Prime games did something amazing with the same concept, with scanning acting as not only a guiding hand in a similar way to the X-ray advisor of Super, but an incentive in itself to take your time looking around the environment and exploring the world. The Scan Pulse feels like a step back in this regard, which sucks because the textural world building that came with Prime scanning would have been a perfect fit for the ruins of Chozo civilization in the bowels of SR388. On that note, aesthetically, the game's hit or miss. Most of the game is just a bunch of dark, rocky crawl spaces and dull purple caves filled with acid, and the only bright-colored area that sticks out in my mind is filled with brightly colored enemies that blend into the background. And even when the game does do a chill, low-key tone pretty well with the music and the atmosphere, it gets totally interrupted the second you walk into the heated rooms that pointlessly stick around throughout the game, and oh fucking hell, why are we using Ridley's Hide as a fire theme again? But well, that was what I had thought originally. Once I started paying more attention, I almost feel like I can see where the focus really went. One way the game really benefited from going 2.5D is they could go absolutely nuts with the background detail. There are a few nice scenes I felt like I could just sit back and chill in. The open caverns can get this tremendous sense of scale as the ruins trail off into the distance, and there's a vibrant diversity to the flora and fauna of the planet that you can see just existing in your periphery. Bugs crawling along the walls, weird dragon things drinking water only to run off when they see you approach, abandoned mining robots working away for eternity. But once you snap back to the part of the game you're actually interacting with, it's the same half-dozen enemies with occasional color swaps, and the level geometry is all low-res, blocky-ass rocks and ruins that just numb your senses. And the result of that is I ended up not remembering the layout of the world all that much. The visuals could have done a lot to make each room a unique and memorable landmark. Even some of the most labyrinthine areas of previous games made use of some wayfinding tricks so you weren't ever too lost. But that only ends up happening here for the obviously big areas, and a lot of the catacombs beneath them end up feeling way too generic and messy. But one more minor nitpick. The game really shouldn't have this many cutscenes. Well, again, it does have a lot of small scenes in the background that make you feel observant when they catch your eye, and some notable exceptions where they actually do leave Samus entirely in your control before bosses, usually the Metroid fights where you've already been introduced to the given mutation. But there's still a frustrating number of times where the devs figured they needed a cutscene and didn't ask themselves if they could get information across without playing a short fucking movie at them. This is a problem I have with the Prime games too, to be fair. Taking control away from the player disconnects them from Samus. It makes me feel like the devs aren't confident enough in their own ability or your own intellect to be able to figure out what's happening, and it's just a frustrating layer of artifice for the game to grab you and shove things you should see in front of your eyes that ends up making everything feel a bit too structured, like you're always safe because you're never going somewhere you shouldn't be. Super and Fusion have some amazing atmosphere and tension, specifically because they always keep Samus in the player's control, and I feel like Samus Returns would be leagues better if it did the same. But no discussion of this game would be complete without the fact that it is a bad remake. The opening to the original Metroid is a classic theme among Nintendo's repertoire. It has elements of sci-fi and horror to its arrangement, but its melody is still bold and triumphant, which makes it so startling that its sequel would open with silence. A repetitive, high-pitched sting, atonal noise, swelling in intensity, before beginning a quiet, melancholy melody. The wider range, diatonic upward motion, and triumphant leaps of the original is replaced with a descending chromatic bass line, and a downward, strictly stepwise moving melody, with the effective range of about a fifth, spending 4 measures on the tonic. Even when the theme seems to fit thematically with its predecessor, feeling like a determined march, it's in an uneven 9/8 time signature, and it's underpinned by a droning sound, eerily similar to Low Health Alert, all of which slowly fades back into the silence of space. Metroid 2 is a weird game. It's a linear, clunky mess that has more E-tanks than you can carry, and actually a fucking banger of a soundtrack, but this isn't a bad thing. As an experimental sequel to the original NES game, it decided to go in a more linear but immersive direction. It told a dark story where you descended into the depths of a planet, committing genocide on an alien species. While it might seem clunky and dated in the modern age, it is an experience you really should give the time of day. And Samus Returns is just not a good representation of that experience, and its title theme is perhaps a great example of one of its major problems. Not only does it reintroduce the classic Metroid theme and include the original Game Boy made sound of the original sting to try and tickle the nostalgia nerves in our monkey brains, but the entire arrangement just sounds way too triumphant for the story Metroid 2 told, with even the unnerving quiet section given a choir to ease your nerves. It's a great metaphor for the game as a remake. It trumpets the nostalgia of the original game, all the while nullifying its strengths, seemingly in an attempt to make it fit in more with the rest of the series and be more palatable to the average player. There are a lot of other things that Samus Returns does to nullify the feelings that Return of Samus elicited, but I'd just be wasting my breath. Several people smarter than I am have already come to the defense of Return of Samus, particularly thanks to the buzz surrounding Samus Returns. Mark Brown in particular more generally talks about why modernizing the game at all isn't exactly a great idea for its legacy. I'm not even particularly attached to the original, so a lot of what I said here isn't entirely my own contribution to the discussion. It's mostly been taken from what others have already said about the game. But that's not to say Samus Returns had to faithfully recreate Return of Samus. Looking back at a game like Zero Mission, which radically changed the source material in an attempt to make the game more accessible to new players and more similar to other games in the series, you might be tempted to argue Samus Returns is more of a reimagining of the game. Even if you think it's a worse game, at least they tried something different. Problem is, especially with the current culture of constant remakes of older games, there's a sense that a remake, whether it's faithful to the original or not, is the definitive way to experience the game. There are going to be many people who choose Samus Returns as their first playthrough of this entry because it's a more recent and approachable game than Return of Samus, and will never play the original because they believe they've experienced the game through Samus Returns. The same is undoubtedly true for Metroid 1 and Zero Mission, but Zero Mission at least gave you the entirety of the original game to play when you finished the main game, with the unintuitive traits of that NES-era design alleviated somewhat by the fact that the player now knows the general layout of Zebes from playing Zero Mission. And to be fair, Samus Returns did this too. You do get the original Return of Samus in the Collector's Edition, and only in Europe. Aside from that, did anyone else get some bad performance? The frame rate can get pretty low, particularly in loading screens. I think I remember getting a few noticeable dips back when I first played it on console, and I even had it crash once. This is a dev team that had prior experience on 3DS. But whatever. All of this makes a game that's at best mediocre and something I wouldn't want to pick up again after playing it once or twice. Game bad, big fucking whoop. So why do I care so much? My interest was initially piqued during the Samus Returns Treehouse reveal when the demonstrator decided to bomb jump to get out of a pit. Admittedly, she should have just used the spider ball, but the statement was still important. They were implying that there'd be some secret techniques and maybe even sequence breaking in the game, and I had inferred that, just like Super and Zero Mission, you'd be able to bend the game to your will if you were good enough. Playing the game for myself was disappointing. The space jump is given to you fairly early in the game, the second earliest of the 2D games, only behind the original Return of Samus, so bomb jumping is only useful for maybe half of the game. But in that time, I'd often bomb jump to get to a higher ledge and feel good about myself for a second, and then curse when I find the only thing up there was the backside of a one-way door. And that's even if you can jump up there, because any obstacle that requires some movement-based item will also involve copious air vents to make sure you don't get any funny ideas. It's kind of painful because there are still so many parts of the game where it's screaming at me that I could just skip this item. Maybe if I bomb jumped up there, maybe if I rushed through that heated room. But even if I can, it never works out down the line. And trying ends up being too much of a hassle, either by wasting my time or just flat out killing me. But that's not to say bomb jumping is useless. Something that even Fusion did was let players cut down on the tedium of cleaning up optional items at the end by taking care of the more tedious ones to backtrack through when you're first passing through the area, saving you a lot of tedious backtracking in the endgame. Samus Returns even does this too. There are some items you can get when you first find them through closer observation or hidden techniques, but the only reward for getting the items early is having the items early. There's rarely a benefit to your route because the items you can sneakily get earlier are still placed right next to ones you can't, and so your cleanup will still consist of walking all the way back through some early game content you forgot about hours ago to pick up one item in one boring ass room in a cul-de-sac. And of course, having even optional items early can be very important, particularly to new players who aren't good enough to get by without them. But by locking the items behind hidden techniques, it's a weird situation where experienced players that know how to get these items early are more likely to pass them up because they're quicker to get later, and players that actually need them early are given every indication that they can't get them. Of course, there are some sequence breaks. Surprisingly, you can actually skip high jump and spring ball through some tricky bomb jumps, but the tricks are sketchy enough that I'm willing to bet they're unintentional. Besides, if they wanted us morphing precisely in midair, they wouldn't have put the morph button on the fucking touchscreen. Even space jump, an item the entire latter half of the game is designed around, can be safely ignored. In fact, it actually became kind of fun to get through that latter half with only bomb jumping. But not only could I personally not get into Area 6 without the high jump, but I mean, the space jump is right there. Not only do you still have to go through the entire Digonaut encounter before you get it, but you literally step over it in order to skip it. There is no reason for the player to skip these beyond their own tenacity. In fact, not only is there no recognition of low completion rates, but major items aren't even counted in the percentage, so not even low percent runs skip these items. But even for those poor souls who decided to speedrun this game, the only sequence breaks of any real note are clearly unintended and often involve clipping out of the map through precise exploits, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's the difference between your run ending like this or like this. This in particular might seem like a weird criticism, as speedrunning is typically seen to be a very death of the author's subculture. And you'd be right. If I were talking about a game like Metroid Prime, which turned multi-bomb jumping into a minor mechanic used for puzzles and actively patched sequence breaks out of later versions of the game, bringing up how good a speedrun this game is wouldn't matter as much. That is clearly not what Retro wanted the game to be, and arguably not criteria it should be judged on. And that's arguably the case for Samus Returns. The game drops the speed booster and hence shine sparking in favor of a power bomb jump, which replaces the skill required in the GBA games with some mediocre puzzles and item management. They also decided to simplify wall jumps to be more like bog standard Mario fare and went for the dumb nerfed fusion variants that yeets you away from the wall, a particularly confusing choice as single wall jumps in games like Super and Zero Mission were less flexible than the spider ball is in Metroid 2, only faster, and their usefulness in Samus Returns is still fundamentally hampered by all the slimy walls and the fact that you can't do them if you don't have enough space. I don't really like either of these changes from 2D Metroid, but they give this clear impression of a game about linear progression rather than hidden non-linearity that prioritizes ease of use over skill and complexity. And in this way, almost everything about the world and the movement makes sense. But then why is infinite bomb jumping here? It doesn't feel like it was a major consideration when they were designing the world, and if it does, it's because they were designing against it. It's not like it's a key mechanic of the series, only 2 games had it. And it's not like it would have been hard to get rid of, just make the bomb timers longer like Fusion did, or maybe just extend the code from the water physics where you don't get as much height from successive jumps. But no, they explicitly decided that they want infinite bomb jumping in the game. If they didn't, they would have fixed it, or maybe they wouldn't have had the demonstrator do it at a clearly planned section of their demonstration, or not put it in the fucking trailer. But why? Why did they decide to code an entire mechanic for no apparent reason but to be a callback to older games? Of course, Even still, maybe judging the game on its speedrunner friendliness is unfair. Maybe it's better if I look at it as an introductory game to people who couldn't get behind the design of the older games, in comparison to the more cinematic and atmospheric Prime games, or maybe I should just look at it on its own merits as a fun little romp, but no. Under any criteria I can think of, the game just doesn't work. It's not an accurate representation of Return of Samus, it's not an intricate knot like Super Metroid, it's not as good an introduction to the series as Zero Mission, it's not as good a world to explore as the Prime games. For fuck's sake, it's not even as good an action game as Other M. And while these games are by no means perfect, and even have flaws with the things they do really well, they still blow Samus Returns out of the water despite releasing 10 years prior. And that's very likely because they know what they want to be, while Samus Returns feels like it's trying to be every single one of those at once in some way. And the result is an unfocused mush of half-formed ideas that hides whatever it is Mercury Steam actually want to do. Because, yeah, there is some good to be found here. The environments can feel really striking, even if most of them feel like they were thrown together to meet deadlines. The cutscenes might bog down the experience, but they're well crafted, even great at times. And I might like the counter on principle and in its bad cases, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel satisfying to land, even ad nauseum. The game feels like it has the potential to be so much better than it is, but it got bogged down in trying to deliver a traditional Metroid experience on the 3DS in a short turnaround time. But what if that wasn't the case? What if Mercury Steam didn't remake an already existing game, but instead gave themselves fully to creating their own Metroid game in the series? Like, the Aeon powers were alright, even if they don't really feel like they're that much different to just a regular power-up with some boring air of magic around them. But what if you expanded on it? Give us a Metroid game with these vastly different items to anything we've seen before, and give it this cool kind of magic meter that you have to manage carefully as you fight. Heck, the idea that the Metroids and the X can absorb the ability of their prey could justify something like the Soul mechanic of Castlevania's Sorrow titles. Why couldn't this game have been like that? Why does the game feel like it's so bog standard with only a few new things tacked on? Why did Nintendo want us to think that this is the next Super Metroid? Why did the glorious return of the Metroid franchise need to be a remake? Why does Samus Returns exist? In the original Return of Samus, after defeating the Queen Metroid, you fled the planet with the baby Metroid. After killing everything in your path, you're given a companion that helps you escape by gobbling up crystals in your path, along with a nice somber moment to bask in the fact that your work was done and think back over your journey. And then, you got in your ship and left. Mission complete. In Samus Returns, after you meet the baby, the game shifts straight back into combat with barely a second to breathe. The path back up to the surface is filled with enemies and even has a few items to pick up along the way. And then, right when you reach the surface, you're given a teleporter. You probably remember a few places throughout the game that has those crystals the baby can eat up, so now you can go back and get them. This is the point where you can go on your little victory lap throughout the game to get the 100% of items, but for what? You killed every Metroid on the planet, part 1. That was your mission. That was the point of this, right? No, of course not. That wasn't the point. Who the hell cares about all that genocide you just did, the effect that this extinction could have on the local ecosystem, or why Samus decided to spare the last Metroid in her way? That's not what this game is about. It's about Ridley! Right as you're about to escape, Ridley shows up, and now Samus has to fight him to protect the baby. And there are these cool cutscenes where Samus is all like, whoo, pew, pew. And Ridley's all like, oh no, you got me. Haha, just kidding. Oh, I got you good. And then there's a bit partway through where Samus is about to die, but the baby rushes in to save her. And now Ridley's dead. Okay, I am not someone who cares about plot holes or inconsistencies, but now we've got the baby saving Samus from Ridley, the baby saving Samus from Mother Brain, and the baby's DNA saving Samus from the X-Parasite, at which point Samus recalls that the baby saved her life twice. Whatever, this is the third time that a dev team outside of Nintendo has taken on the Metroid series and the game contradicted Fusion. I am used to it at this point. Oh, and sure, put in the interactions with the baby to have the player feel like they're trying to protect it and give them a deeper connection. That's fine. Seriously, it's not like there's already an entire game dedicated to having you do exactly that, but that's only the tip of the fucking iceberg. Sit yourselves down because I am back on my Ridley shit again. Metroid is about growth. The entire point of the gameplay loop, collecting items which let you explore the world and kill enemies, is that you're adding to an arsenal that you're constantly using, and you gradually feel like a powerhouse because of that. Ridley is the perfect personification of this. If Ridley's in the game, you know it well before you fight him. Maybe he'll just be a statue in a paragraph in the manual. Maybe he'll show up in a few cutscenes, or maybe you'll even get to fight him twice, with the first fight showing Samus at a significant disadvantage. But it all sets up Ridley as a goal for the player. He's rarely ever the final boss of a Metroid game, but he's always the most memorable thing about it because you always know he's there. And in his best appearances, you'll be spending the entire game thinking, I'm gonna get stronger because I want to beat him. Even the dumb Ridley robot in Zero Mission was foreshadowed. The last time that a Metroid remake added some extra content to the end of game, Ridley was still the goal. But here, it's Ridley. He just shows up, totally unprompted, totally disconnected from the plot, and you kill him. Sure, the mining robot arguably serves Ridley's purpose, and it even gets 2 combat encounters like Dark Samus and the SAX-4, but the fact that they just thoughtlessly plopped Ridley in at the end as well, regardless of what it does to Ridley's character or to the original ending, is insulting to both. That's what this game is. It's insulting. It's throwing elements of the series together without thinking of why they worked well in the first place. And for what? Why do they throw Ridley in? Why does Samus Returns exist? Fan service. I wasn't going to bring AM2R into this. I don't want to seem like that elitist fucker that thinks these speedrunner-friendly Metroid games are oh so clearly superior. I am absolutely that fucker, but you know what? It isn't even all that great. It's a game for Metroid fans, but that also means it's a lot harder than the other games in the series, and all the hidden techniques still feel like in-jokes that you'd only get if you've played Super. For all its frustration, Samus Returns easily beats it in making a game that's more accessible to new players. But it has a lot of the same problems as Samus Returns, where the linear structure means they can only really make unattainable items in earlier areas optional in an attempt to make the game as non-linear as they want. And anything they add to the game to make it more non-linear still does mess with the original feeling of a Return of Samus. The community updates had to basically delete the structure of the original to implement randomizers. Neither of these games are all that great at preserving what made Return of Samus a game worth preserving. I really don't want to talk about how it still managed to keep a lot of the cool things the original did, mostly because it front-loaded all of its non-linear stuff to let the very important last stretch stay mostly unchanged. I wasn't going to mention how they clearly understand what makes good Metroidvania design even when they have to shame themselves to such a linear game. But fuck it. If Samus Returns is gonna pull this shit, it doesn't deserve me going easy on it. Look at this! It's Ceres, the boss from Fusion, just like how Fusion reused Arrakis from Return of Samus. Look at this, an entire optional area with an optional boss full of dead Federation soldiers with logs to read, and they all elaborate on aspects of the world and even make nods to other elements of the series. And right next to it, this! It's the cave from the opening cutscene to Fusion, when Samus encounters the X-Parasite on SR388. This is good fan service. It's short, sweet, and out of the way for people who want to find it without massively distorting the whole point of the game. It's attention to detail, cute little nods to other games that make sense in the universe to reward people for paying attention to all the little things. Not the same old boss, or the same old fire theme, or the same old NES sprites and chiptune music, or remake after remake in the guise of a reinvented classic, but really, just because you want to jerk off the nostalgia of your man-child fanbase that comes back after every time you fucking hit them because you bought them flowers. I grew up with Nintendo. So much of my childhood has revolved around their games that I've got so many memories of playing games like Mario Galaxy and Twilight Princess, or Smash and Mario Party with friends. And given that I grew up around the internet consuming so much content from earlier creators that held up their games as classics and the greatest of all time, this is a company that I've grown to hold pretty close to my heart, with or without my consent. And that sucks because for these last few years, I have been bombarded with the shittiness of the company. I've watched their fanbase working their ass off to enjoy and celebrate their favorite games, only to be met with everything from death by inaction to fierce resistance. I hesitantly supported them through the Wii U era, all the while they pushed out shitty games with barely any heart. And even today, though I'm not following them as intently as I probably could be, it feels like this company that used to try pushing the medium further than anyone else wanted to is stuck in the past. Most of their releases this past while especially have been remakes, shamelessly rehashing even the smaller titles in their catalog. And those that aren't still feel like they're playing second fiddle to the last 10 years of gaming. I've really had to ask myself if I even care about them anymore, much less if I could call myself a fan. But it's been in those same few years that I fell in love with Metroid. It was a series that almost didn't feel like Nintendo made it. It was overtly dark, regularly depicting death explicitly caused by your own hand. It was complex and obtuse, often more interested in intentionally being an uncomfortable experience than the fun playground of their other games. And it would even shamelessly push itself away from so much of its identity to achieve that goal. And you can kind of tell Nintendo didn't want to make these kinds of games. After Super, the series was only revived when Nintendo gave the reins to Retro Studios. And more than half the series at this point has been made by third and second party developers since then. And that's awesome. The Prime games and the slew of indie games show how different perspectives can bring new life to the genre this series kickstarted. I'd even say that Other M and Federation Force show how the story of the series can be explored without limiting the games to being isolated experiences. But those two weren't well received, and for Federation Force in particular, it was because it just wasn't a real Metroid game. And 6 years after Other M, that reaction was probably justified. So maybe Samus Returns was just a safe bet in that regard, a game where they could prove they can still make a Metroid game like you remember it, or at least they can get some third-party dev to do it. But because of that, what we ended up with was a game that stinks of Nintendo's iconography-obsessed nostalgia baiting, despite not being made by Nintendo, that feels like it exists solely to sell amiibo and cash in on the dying handheld by marketing to their most diehard fanbase, rather than being a good game in its own right. And to me, it was done for the one series it just shouldn't have. In an FAQ on the Japanese Zero Mission site, Yoshio Sakamoto was asked what the most important rule for making a Metroid game was. What is the one rule you can't break? His response? For the series to continue, it has to be dramatic, and something should remain in the hearts of players after they've cleared it. So I'm always conscious of methods for preventing the series from becoming ordinary. That's my biggest problem with Samus Returns. It boils Metroid down to a few superficial traits and throws them together into a soup. It turns it into a checklist of meaningless elements that need to be put in so the fans will like it. It makes Metroid ordinary. And with the response this game has got, not so much its actual reception, but the deafening chorus of, "This has to sell well, or it's the last we'll get," I have to ask, is this what you want? For Nintendo to know that they can just pay someone to shit something out and you'll eat it up if they tell you it's Metroid? Are you really so starving that this is good enough? Because if you're looking for a real Metroid game, there have been countless games in the past few years that could have scratched that itch and put your money towards more deserving developers. Heck, there's more games that pay nothing but lip service to Metroid that still feel like more loving homages and better games in their own right. But if there's something special about this series that no others can match, then how does Samus Returns capture that? Maybe I just don't see what people actually like about this game, but if this is what the series becomes, a lifeless puppet that Nintendo can doll up in that old stained Metroid dress to put on a show, handing the strings over to any deadbeat that'll actually want to take it, I'd rather it died in 2010. I'd be much happier if the series ended with a beautiful train wreck than if it died a slow, painful death by mediocrity. Fuck.